They were erasing his life like chalk from a blackboard. 40 years of memories, effort, love, all being loaded into a charity truck by the children he'd once thought would stand beside him until his final breath. He'd been wrong. William Bennett stood on the sidewalk outside the house where he'd lived for 23 years, watching strangers in orange vests carry away everything he and Maggie had built together. Not his children's truck, not even a storage unit where they might keep his belongings safe in case he needed them later. A donation truck operated by people who would sort through the remnants of his existence and decide what deserved to keep and what deserved to be thrown away. At 77 years old, his own children were treating him like an inconvenience to be disposed of as quickly and efficiently as possible. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yellowing paint of the modest two-story house. Maggie had loved that house. She'd tended the overgrown garden as well as her aging body would allow, had kept the interior spotless, despite their limited income. 6 months ago, when she was still alive, they'd been fine here. Not wealthy, never wealthy, but stable, safe, together. Then the cancer took her, and everything fell apart like dominoes. The elderly landlord, the kind man who'd shaken William's hand and said, "Stay as long as you need," had passed away 3 months after Maggie, 92 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep. His daughter, a woman William had never met, who lived in California and saw the property only as a financial asset, had immediately sold to developers planning to tear it down and build something modern and profitable. William, who'd never had a formal lease, just a handshake agreement with a man now gone, just a verbal promise that meant nothing in the eyes of the law, had no legal right to stay. His children could have helped him fight it, could have hired a lawyer to at least delay the eviction, could have argued for tenant rights or demanded more time to find alternative housing. Robert was a lawyer himself, for God's sake, a successful one at a big corporate firm downtown. Instead, they'd shrugged and said it was probably for the best that he moved into some kind of facility where he'd be properly taken care of by people trained for that sort of thing. As if he was an object requiring specialized handling rather than their father who'd devoted his entire life to raising them. William had refused absolutely. He wasn't going to some facility to sit in a communal room playing bingo while waiting to die. Wasn't going to surrender the last shreds of his independence and dignity to become another elderly person warehoused until death. So his children had simply stopped helping. Stopped calling except to ask when he'd be out. Stopped visiting. Started treating him like he was already gone, erased from their lives. And now here he was standing on a sidewalk that wouldn't be his in 24 hours, watching his life disappear into cardboard boxes. Robert approached his expensive suit crisp in the morning light. 52 years old, William's oldest son, the baby he had rocked through countless sleepless nights. The boy who'd once looked up at him with such admiration. Now he couldn't even meet his father's eyes. "Dad, you really need to move now," Robert said, his voice flat and businesslike, the same tone he probably used with difficult clients at his law firm. "The new owners are coming tomorrow morning to start renovations. You can't be here when they arrive. It'll be awkward for everyone." Awkward. That was the word he chose. Not tragic, not unjust, not heartbreaking. Awkward. William looked at the house one last time. The peeling yellow paint, the garden Maggie had loved. The window of the bedroom where she died in his arms, whispering apologies he'd tried desperately to silence. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" William asked quietly, trying to keep his voice steady, even though his chest felt tight with suppressed panic and grief. Catherine, his 48-year-old daughter, finally looked at him with barely concealed exasperation mixed with what might have been guilt, but looked more like irritation at being made to feel guilty. "Dad, we've been over this 100 times. You can't stay with any of us. We literally don't have room. David has the new baby, and his house is already crowded. I have my career, and I travel constantly for work. Robert's house is too small, and Linda has made it very clear she doesn't want long-term house guests. We're not being mean. We're being realistic. We told you months ago to apply for senior housing." "I did apply, son," William said, fighting to keep his voice from shaking. "I applied to every single facility within 30 miles. There's a waiting list for all of them. 9 months minimum, most of them over a year. They told me that explicitly. I can't just magically make a space appear." "Well, that's not our fault, is it?" Robert snapped his patience, what little he'd started with, clearly exhausted. The words that came next landed like physical blows, each one carrying 40 years of accumulated resentment that William hadn't fully understood until this moment. You should have planned better, Dad. You should have saved money over the years. Should have had something in place for emergencies. This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead, without building any kind of financial security. You were a lawyer, for God's sake. You should have known better. But no, you spent everything on Mom, on hospitals, on treatments that were hopeless just to buy a few more months. And now you're standing here with nothing. That's not our fault, Dad. Those are the consequences of your choices. Actions have consequences. The silence that followed was deafening. William stood very still, letting the full weight of those words settle into his bones. His children blamed him for being poor, blamed him for not having savings and backup plans and safety nets, blamed him for the crime of having devoted every dollar and every ounce of energy to keeping Maggie alive as long as possible instead of building a fortress of financial security for his old age. They didn't understand, had never understood, probably never would. A memory surfaced unbidden. Maggie's hand in his 40 years ago, standing outside the county courthouse after they'd married. No church wedding, no family, no celebration. Just two people who loved each other, choosing each other against the whole world. She'd looked up at him with those beautiful eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry, Will. I'm so sorry you lost everything because of me." And he'd said what he'd always said, "I lost nothing, I gained everything." He'd meant it then, he meant it now. William reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. Inside was a photograph of Maggie taken on their 20th anniversary. She was smiling, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her eyes full of the love that had sustained him through everything. He looked at his three children, looked at these people he had raised who'd received every advantage he and Maggie could provide, who'd gone to good schools and built successful careers and raised families of their own. And he made a decision. "I have somewhere to go," William said suddenly, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the thought. Desperation creating an escape plan in real time. "Eleanor Hayes' old property, your grandmother's land. The main house is gone, but the land is still in the family trust. There's a basement structure in the back built into the hillside. It's still standing. I can stay there." His children looked at each other and actually laughed. Not nervous laughter or uncomfortable chuckling, but genuine amusement at what they clearly considered a ridiculous idea. That old dump, David, his youngest at 45, spoke for the first time all morning, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone his siblings had mastered. "Dad, that place has been abandoned for 15 years since the house burned down. There's no electricity, no running water, probably no roof left that doesn't leak. You can't seriously think you can live there. It's not even a house anymore, just a hole in the ground." William turned to face his youngest son fully, looked him in the eye with the same steady gaze he'd once used in courtrooms when opposing counsel tried to rattle him. "I'm not asking your permission," William interrupted, and something in his voice made all three of them stop and actually look at him for the first time that morning. "I'm telling you where I'll be. If you need me for anything, though I sincerely doubt you will, that's where I'll be. If you ever decide you actually care what happens to me, you'll know where to find me. Not that I'm holding my breath, waiting for that particular miracle." The legal training never left you, William thought. Even at 77, even devastated, he could still make his voice carry authority when necessary. He picked up his single suitcase, the only thing they'd agreed to let him keep from an entire household of possessions, and started walking down the sidewalk. He didn't look back to see if they were watching, didn't want to see if they cared, didn't want to witness their relief that the difficult problem of their elderly father had finally solved itself through his own exile. Behind him, he heard Robert's voice, dismissive and cold, carrying clearly in the morning air. "Let him go. Give him a week, maybe 2 at most. He'll come crawling back when he realizes he can't handle living in a basement like some kind of homeless person. Then maybe he'll be reasonable about accepting a facility placement instead of making everything so difficult." William kept walking, each step taking him away from the children who'd failed him in every way that mattered, and toward a place he hadn't visited in 50 years. Toward a promise his mother-in-law had made in a whisper on her deathbed. Words that had seemed meaningless at the time, but that William had nevertheless remembered because Maggie had made him promise to remember. The morning after Eleanor Hayes died, Maggie had sat at their kitchen table, tears streaming down her face, and told him about her mother's final words. She was barely conscious, Maggie had said, but she grabbed my hand so tight, Will, so tight it hurt. And she said, when you have nowhere left to go, when you have lost everything, go to the sanctuary. I left you something there, something important, something that will save you when you need it most. Promise me you'll remember Maggie. Promise me. Maggie had promised, holding her dying mother's hand and thinking it was just the rambling of someone whose mind was fading. And now, 50 years later, William was finally going to find out what Eleanor Hayes had meant. The walk was 3 miles, all of it uphill. At 77, William's body protested every step. His knees, worn from years of standing in courtrooms, ached. His back, bent from decades of hunching over legal briefs, complained. But he'd served in Vietnam. He knew how to march through pain, knew how to put one foot in front of the other when everything hurt. The suitcase wasn't heavy. That was the saddest part. Everything he owned in the world, and it barely weighed 20 pounds. As he walked, memories came flooding back. The property had belonged to Eleanor Hayes, Maggie's mother, a strong woman, an Irish immigrant who'd come to America in 1920 with nothing but a trunk full of hopes and a determination to build something better. She'd married Charles Hayes, a carpenter, and together they'd bought the land 3 miles outside Riverside, built a modest house, raised Maggie there, made a life. The house had burned down 15 years ago in an electrical fire that destroyed everything above ground, leaving nothing but a charred foundation that nature had gradually reclaimed. The insurance money had gone into the family trust divided among Eleanor's descendants, according to a complicated legal arrangement. William and Maggie had received their small share, maybe $8,000, which they'd immediately spent on medical bills after the first cancer scare. The land itself had sat empty and untouched since then. Too rural and too damaged to attract buyers, too legally complicated to develop or sell. The family trust paid minimal property taxes to keep it from being seized by the county, but nobody had visited in years. Nobody except William apparently even remembered it existed as anything other than a line item in an accounting ledger. But William remembered the sanctuary, not a basement under the house, but a completely separate structure. A root cellar that Charles Hayes had built sometime in the early 1940s, dug deep into the hillside behind where the house had stood. It was an old-fashioned design, the kind of storage space people created before reliable refrigeration meant to keep vegetables and preserves cool through the summer and from freezing in winter. Eleanor had used it for exactly that purpose, but she'd also treated it as something more, a private space, a place that was entirely hers. William remembered visiting once, maybe 45 years ago, when he and Maggie were newlyweds. Eleanor had shown them with obvious pride, her voice carrying a particular emphasis. My sanctuary, she'd called it, the only place that's entirely mine, where I can think and breathe and be myself without anyone watching or judging or needing something from me. Maggie had been 25 years old the last time she'd visited that sanctuary, just before her life had fallen apart in ways she couldn't have imagined. Just before the scandal that had destroyed her reputation and nearly destroyed her entirely. William pushed those memories away. Not yet. He couldn't afford to remember the full story yet. Not while he was still walking. Not while he still had to stay functional. The property came into view as he crested the final hill. His breath was ragged now, his legs trembling with exhaustion. 90 minutes of uphill walking at 77 would do that. The house was gone completely. Nothing remaining except a concrete foundation overtaken by aggressive weeds and small trees that had taken root in the cracks. Nature had reclaimed the space enthusiastically, erasing almost all evidence that humans had ever lived there. But beyond the foundation built into the hillside, exactly as he remembered, was the sanctuary entrance. A heavy wooden door set into mortared stone, weathered and moss-covered, but still fundamentally solid. William approached it slowly, his heart pounding hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. The door was smaller than he remembered, but everything from distant memory seemed larger than reality. A rusted padlock hung from the latch, covered in decades of oxidation, looking like it might disintegrate if touched too hard. William reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something Maggie had given him the day before she died. Her hand had been so frail, the skin paper-thin and bruised from needles. But her grip had been surprisingly strong when she'd pressed the small brass key on a tarnished chain into his palm. For the sanctuary, she'd whispered, her voice barely audible but intense with urgency. When you need it most, when you have nothing left, remember, Will. Mama left something for us. Promise me you'll remember. William's hand shook badly as he fitted the key into the padlock. It stuck at first, decades of rust and corrosion fighting against him. But he twisted harder, using both hands and all his remaining strength. With a grinding screech that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest, the lock opened. The door itself was much harder, swollen with moisture and age warped by decades of weather. It took all of William's strength to pull it open even an inch. He braced his feet, grabbed the old iron handle with both hands, and pulled with everything he had. The door fought him, groaning in protest, but finally gave way with a sound like tearing fabric. A cloud of musty air rushed out when the door opened, carrying the scent of earth and old wood and something else. Something faint but unmistakable. Lavender. Eleanor's scent. The smell she'd carried with her always, that had perfumed her clothes and her hair and had seemed to fill any room she entered. But Eleanor had been dead for 50 years. William pulled a small flashlight from his suitcase, one of the few practical items his children had allowed him to keep, and clicked it on with fingers that trembled. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a space that was larger than he'd remembered. It stretched back into the hillside with a curved ceiling of mortared stone and heavy timber beams. Shelves lined the walls on both sides, most completely empty, now some still holding ancient mason jars covered in dust and cobwebs, their contents long since spoiled and forgotten. But at the very back of the sanctuary, illuminated clearly in his flashlight beam, sat a large trunk. Dark wood bound with brass fittings, exactly as he remembered it from one brief glimpse decades ago. Eleanor's hope chest, the trunk she'd brought with her when she'd immigrated to America from Ireland in 1920, carrying everything she owned in the world. The trunk that had held her most precious possessions: wedding dress, family photographs, documents, treasures. William walked toward it slowly, his flashlight beam steady despite his trembling hands. He could barely breathe, could barely think past the pounding of his heart. The trunk was sealed with red wax, the seal unbroken after all these years, perfectly preserved in the cool, dry air of the sanctuary. And pressed into the wax was Eleanor's cameo ring, the one she'd worn every single day of her life, the one she'd been buried without because she'd secretly taken it off beforehand and hidden it here. This wasn't just locked away. This was sealed, preserved, protected, meant to last decades, meant to be found at exactly the right moment. William set down his flashlight, carefully positioning it so the beam illuminated the trunk fully. Then, with hands that had practiced law for 40 years, hands that knew how to be gentle and precise when necessary, he carefully broke the wax seal. The lid was heavy, solid wood that hadn't warped despite the decades. But it opened smoothly on hinges that had been well made and had lasted. And there inside the trunk, carefully preserved in layers of tissue paper and scattered lavender sachets, was something William hadn't expected. Not Maggie's wedding dress as the story had gone in the original telling, but his wedding suit, the charcoal gray suit he'd planned to wear on June 15th, 1985, the day that should have been the happiest of his life, the day that never came because Jonathan Hartwell had destroyed it with lies. William stared at the suit, unable to breathe, unable to think, as 40 years of carefully suppressed memories came flooding back with crushing, overwhelming force. He'd been 37 years old when he met Maggie Bennett, a young lawyer, ambitious and driven, recently divorced from a first marriage that had dissolved due to irreconcilable differences. No children from that union, thank God. Just two people who'd realized too late they wanted different things from life. He'd come to Maggie's small alteration shop to have a suit tailored. She'd been 35, running a modest seamstress business from a tiny storefront, taking in work from the few people in town willing to employ that woman. Even then, even before he knew her story, William had noticed how people treated her. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the way customers would drop off clothes and leave quickly, barely making eye contact. But Maggie herself had been extraordinary. The precision of her work, the artistry in how she understood fabric and form, and those eyes, sad and deep, carrying secrets she wouldn't share. They'd started talking during fitting appointments. He'd told her about his work, about the satisfaction of defending people who needed help. She'd told him about her love of creating beautiful things, of taking something ordinary and making it special. Within 6 months, he'd asked her to marry him. His family had been horrified. His colleagues had expressed concern. Everyone seemed to know something about Maggie's past, some scandal that made her unsuitable, but no one would explain it directly. William hadn't cared. He'd looked into Maggie's eyes and seen goodness, integrity, pain that she didn't deserve. And he'd made his choice. They'd planned a church wedding at Riverside Community Church, the largest and most respected in town. Maggie had insisted on making her own wedding dress, pouring all her skill and desperate hope into every stitch. William had bought this suit, the finest he'd ever owned, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes. The wedding was set for June 15th, 1985. Invitations sent, flowers ordered, a small reception planned, and then Pastor Jonathan Hartwell had destroyed everything. 2 weeks before the wedding, Hartwell had gone to the church elders with a story he'd carefully crafted and rehearsed. With tears in his eyes and a voice shaking with what appeared to be righteous anger and betrayed trust, he'd told them that Maggie Bennett had come to his office and inappropriately propositioned him, that she'd been aggressive and inappropriate, suggesting they have an affair, that he'd firmly rejected her advances and told her such behavior was sinful, that she'd become angry and threatening when he'd refused her. He'd said he felt duty-bound to inform the community about her true character before she married an innocent man in God's house. The elders had believed him instantly and completely. A powerful, respected pastor versus a seamstress with no family in town and a past that nobody quite understood. There was no question whom they'd trust. Within 24 hours, the story had spread through Riverside like wildfire. The wedding was canceled by the church. William's family begged him to break the engagement. When he refused, his mother threatened to disown him completely. William remembered standing in Maggie's tiny apartment, holding her while she sobbed, asking the only question that mattered. "Should I believe you?" She'd looked up at him with those devastated eyes and said, "You'll lose everything if you believe me. Your family, your friends, your career. You should leave me." "You didn't answer my question," he'd said quietly. "Should I believe you?" "Yes," she'd whispered. "Yes, you should believe me. I'm innocent." And that had been enough. They'd married at the county courthouse 3 days later. No family, no friends, no celebration. Just two people and a justice of the peace and vows spoken in a sterile office. William had never worn this suit. He'd packed it away, couldn't bear to look at it, this symbol of the wedding that had been stolen from them. And now, 40 years later, here it was, preserved by Eleanor Hayes as carefully as if it were a holy relic. William lifted the suit jacket carefully from the trunk, his hands shaking. The fabric was still beautiful despite its age, the charcoal gray preserved perfectly. But as he lifted it, something felt wrong. The lining was thicker and stiffer than it should have been. Something was hidden inside. With his lawyer's careful eye, William examined the seams and construction. There in the jacket, lining a section that had been opened and resewn. Not Maggie's stitching, which he would have recognized. Someone else's work. Careful and skilled, but different. Hidden. William found a small penknife in his suitcase and carefully, methodically cut the restitched seam. The lining fell open and several envelopes tumbled into his lap. Old envelopes yellowed with decades addressed in different hands to Eleanor Hayes. William picked up the first envelope with shaking hands, barely breathing. It was postmarked August 1985, just 2 months after the scandal that had destroyed their lives. But beneath the stack of old letters, there was one more envelope. Newer, written in handwriting he'd know anywhere. Maggie's handwriting, addressed simply, "For my husband." William's vision blurred with tears as he picked it up. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. Maggie had known. She'd known about the sanctuary, known about the trunk, known about the letters, and she'd left him a message. With trembling fingers, William opened the envelope and began to read his wife's final words to him. The letter was dated 6 months ago, written in the hospital in the final days before cancer took her. As he read, as the truth of 40 years unfolded in Maggie's careful script, William Bennett felt something he hadn't felt since the day they'd married at that courthouse. Not hope, not yet, but purpose. A reason to keep fighting, a battle worth waging. And by God, he was going to wage it. The sun was setting outside, painting the sanctuary entrance with orange and purple light. William sat in the darkness, surrounded by lavender-scented air and 40 years of buried truth, holding letters that would change everything. He was 77 years old. He'd lost his wife. He'd been abandoned by his children. He was living in a basement with nothing but a suitcase and a suit he'd never worn. But he had something Jonathan Hartwell didn't have. He had the truth. And tomorrow was Sunday, which meant tomorrow the whole town would be gathered in one place. William carefully gathered the letters, folded them into his jacket pocket, and stood up. He had work to do before nightfall, because 40 years was long enough to wait for justice. William sat on the cold stone floor of the sanctuary, his back against Eleanor's old hope chest, the flashlight casting long shadows across the curved ceiling. 4 letters lay spread before him like evidence at trial. 3 yellowed with age, their paper brittle and fragile. 1 newer, written in Maggie's careful hand just months before she died. He'd read Maggie's letter first. Had to. Needed to understand why she'd hidden this truth for so long, why she'd let him believe there was no evidence, no proof, no way to clear her name. The words had broken his heart and rebuilt it simultaneously. She'd known about the letters. For 30 years she'd known. Eleanor had told her daughter about them in 1975, 10 years after the scandal, right before the old woman died. Had confessed where they were hidden, had explained why she'd never used them. Hartwell had threatened her, had come to Eleanor's house one evening when she was alone, and made it clear what would happen if she dared to challenge his word with evidence. He'd destroy what remained of Maggie's life. He'd ensure William lost his struggling law practice. He'd make their children suffer. And Eleanor, 70 years old and afraid, had hidden the letters in this sanctuary and kept silent. Maggie had made the same choice. With 3 young children and William finally rebuilding his career after years of being quietly blacklisted, she'd chosen peace over vindication. Had chosen to live with the stain rather than risk losing everything again. I was a coward, she'd written. I told myself I was protecting our family, but the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of fighting. Afraid people still wouldn't believe me, even with proof. And most of all, afraid you'd be angry that I'd known about the evidence and hidden it from you. William had sat in the darkness for a long time after reading that, holding the letter, feeling the full weight of what Maggie had carried alone. She'd been wrong about one thing, though. He wasn't angry. He understood. God help him, he understood completely. She'd done what she thought she had to do to protect their family, to give their children some measure of normalcy, to let William rebuild without the scandal erupting again. But she'd been right about something else, too. He deserved to know, deserved the chance to fight this battle, not just for her memory, but for himself, for their children, for the legacy they'd leave behind. William picked up the first of the old letters, the one dated August 1985, and began to read. The handwriting was neat and precise, the script of someone accustomed to taking careful notes. The signature at the bottom made William's breath catch. Ruth Miller, Hartwell's secretary, the woman who'd sat outside his office for 15 years handling correspondence and appointments. The woman who'd been there. William read slowly, his legal training automatically cataloging the details, assessing the strength of the testimony. Ruth had heard everything, had made the appointment herself when Hartwell called Maggie into his office, had listened through the door as the pastor made inappropriate comments, had heard Maggie's clear, firm rejection, had heard her say she was engaged and leaving, had heard Hartwell's anger after Maggie left, and then Ruth had heard something even more damning. Within an hour, she'd heard Hartwell in his office practicing the story he would tell, creating the lie, rehearsing it until it sounded natural and believable. I wanted desperately to speak up, Ruth had written, but my husband works for a company where Pastor Hartwell sits on the board of directors. If I speak against him publicly, we'll lose everything. I have 3 children to feed and protect. I'm ashamed of my cowardice, Mrs. Hayes, but I cannot find the courage to sacrifice my family even though I know it's the right thing to do. William set the letter down carefully. Ruth Miller. He wondered if she was still alive. She'd have been around 40 back then. Would be 80 now if she'd survived. He made a mental note. Finding Ruth Miller was now a priority. The second letter was from James Thornton, a name William vaguely recognized. A businessman who'd had offices downtown in the 80s. Thornton had witnessed something different, but equally damning. Late one evening in early May 1985, weeks before the scandal broke publicly, Thornton had been walking through the church parking lot as a shortcut to his car. He'd seen Hartwell following Maggie to her vehicle, had watched as the pastor cornered her, blocked her path, touched her arm repeatedly, despite her obvious attempts to leave. I was too far away to hear their conversation clearly. Thornton had written, but I watched him position himself to block her, saw him lean in close in a way that was clearly inappropriate and unwanted. I saw her push his hand away and finally managed to get into her car and drive away quickly. Thornton had wanted to testify, had wanted to defend Maggie publicly, but his wife had reminded him of their business dealings with prominent church members, had threatened to leave him if he got involved, had convinced him that defending a stranger wasn't worth destroying their family. I hate myself for this cowardice, he'd written, but I have children to provide for and a business to protect. Two witnesses, two people who'd seen the truth and documented it even if they'd been too afraid to speak publicly. William picked up the third letter, the one from Eleanor herself addressed to Maggie. His hands shook as he unfolded the brittle paper. Eleanor's letter was longer, more detailed. She explained how the two witness letters had found their way to her, carried by people too afraid to speak publicly, but unwilling to remain completely silent. She described her plan to confront the church elders with the evidence. And then she described what happened when Hartwell found out. He came to my house one evening when I was alone, Eleanor had written. He was a powerful, frightening man when he wanted to be Maggie. He told me in very clear terms what would happen if I tried to use those letters publicly. He would dedicate himself to destroying what remained of your life, completely and thoroughly. Hartwell had been specific. He'd spread worse rumors. He'd ensure Maggie could never work in the county again. He'd make sure William lost his carpentry business. Wait, no. William caught the error. His law practice. Eleanor must have been confused in her grief, mixing up William's profession with her late husband, Charles's carpentry. He said it calmly, almost pleasantly, Eleanor continued, like he was discussing the weather rather than threatening to ruin your entire life. And Maggie, I believed him completely. He had that kind of power in Riverside. So Eleanor had hidden the letters, had sewn them into William's wedding suit, the symbol of what had been stolen, had sealed them in this sanctuary where only Maggie would eventually find them. I hoped desperately that you'd never need them, Eleanor had written, that life would be kind to you, that the scandal would gradually fade. But I'm realistic enough to prepare for darker possibilities. If you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. Use these letters, Maggie. Tell the truth publicly. Make people listen to evidence instead of rumors. William sat back processing what he'd learned. The letters were powerful, compelling, but they were also 40 years old, written by people who might be dead, describing events from a lifetime ago. Would anyone care? Would it matter? Then he thought of Robert's words that morning. That's the consequence of your choices, Dad. Actions have consequences. His own son blaming him for being poor, for spending everything on Maggie's cancer treatment, for not having a financial safety net. His children laughing as he said he'd live in this basement, treating him like a burden, an embarrassment, a problem to be solved. And suddenly William knew with absolute clarity that this wasn't just about clearing Maggie's name anymore. This was about what he'd leave behind, about what his grandchildren would learn from this moment, about whether the Bennett family legacy would be shame and scandal or courage and truth. He thought of Tommy Roberts' 7-year-old son, the boy who'd watched his grandfather being dismissed and mocked this morning. What lesson was Tommy learning? That elderly people were disposable, that family abandoned you when you became inconvenient? No. William wouldn't let that be the lesson. He'd spent 40 years standing by Maggie while the world whispered and judged. He'd sacrificed his relationship with his birth family, had seen his career suffer, had watched his children grow up carrying the weight of their mother's supposed scandal, and he'd never once regretted it, never once wished he'd made a different choice. But his children didn't understand that, couldn't understand it. They'd grown up with the shame, but they'd never understood the love that made the shame worthwhile. Maybe it was time they learned. William stood his joints protesting after sitting on the cold stone floor. He was 77 years old, but he'd been a trial lawyer for 40 years. He knew how to build a case, knew how to present evidence, knew how to make people listen. First, he needed to find Ruth Miller. The Riverside Public Library opened at 8 on Saturday mornings. William knew this because he and Maggie had spent countless Saturday mornings there over the years, her reading historical romances while he worked through legal journals. He arrived when the doors opened, his suit wrinkled from sleeping in it, his face showing the stubble of a man who'd spent the night in a basement with no running water. The librarian, a young woman who didn't recognize him, gave him the kind of look reserved for the homeless. William ignored it. He'd spent 40 years being looked at that way, being judged, being dismissed. One more didn't matter. The library had phone books dating back decades kept for historical research. William found the 1985 directory, first located Ruth Miller's address from that year, then worked forward through the years tracking her movements. She'd lived in the same house until 2010. Then the trail went cold for a few years. Then in 2015, a new listing appeared, Ruth Miller, Riverside Senior Living Facility. Still in Riverside, possibly still alive. William checked the clock. 9:15. He could be at the facility by 9:30. He was out the door before the librarian could ask if he needed help. Riverside Senior Living sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees, a modern building, trying hard to look homey and failing. William had visited places like this when researching options for himself, back when he'd still thought he might have a choice about where he'd spend his final years. The receptionist was professionally cheerful, the kind of forced brightness that came from dealing with death and decline daily. "I'm here to see Ruth Miller," William said. "Are you family?" "I'm an old friend, it's important." Something in his voice, or perhaps in his eyes, made the receptionist nod. "Room 247, second floor." "But sir, I should mention that Mrs. Miller is in hospice care. She may not be up for visitors." Hospice care, which meant time was running out. "I understand," William said, "but she'll want to see me. Tell her it's about Pastor Hartwell and Maggie Bennett." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly. Even she recognized those names, recognized the old scandal. But she picked up the phone and made the call. 3 minutes later, William was being escorted to the second floor. Ruth Miller sat in a wheelchair by the window of her small room, sunlight illuminating how thin she'd become. The cancer had hollowed her out, left her skeletal and pale. But her eyes, when she turned to look at William, were sharp and clear. "William Bennett," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I wondered if you'd ever come looking for me. 40 years I've wondered." William pulled a chair close and sat down so they were eye level. "I have your letter," he said quietly. "The one you wrote to Eleanor Hayes in 1985. I just found it yesterday." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have spoken up. I knew what he did to your wife, and I said nothing. I let her suffer for 40 years because I was a coward." "You documented the truth," William said. "Even when you were too afraid to speak it publicly, you made sure it was recorded. That took courage." "It took cowardice," Ruth said bitterly. "Real courage would have been standing up to him. I had the truth and I buried it to protect my family. Your wife paid the price for my weakness." William reached out and took her frail hand. "Maggie died 6 months ago. Cancer." Ruth closed her eyes, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. She never got to see her name cleared. "Oh God, that's not right. That's not fair." "No," William agreed, "it's not. But I'm going to clear it now, tomorrow. I'm going to make Hartwell admit what he did publicly in front of the whole town. And I'm going to tell them that you tried to help, that you wanted to speak but were afraid. I won't let your conscience carry this anymore." Ruth opened her eyes, searching his face. "Why now? Why after all this time?" "Because my children abandoned me yesterday," William said simply. "Put all my belongings in a donation truck and laughed when I said I'd live in Eleanor's old basement. They're ashamed of me, of Maggie, of our whole family. They grew up carrying the weight of a scandal that never should have happened. And I realize that if I die without fighting this battle, they'll pass that shame on to their children. My grandson Tommy will grow up thinking his grandmother was someone to be ashamed of. I can't let that happen." Ruth nodded slowly. "What do you need from me? Do you still have your office diary from 1985? The appointment book where you scheduled meetings?" Ruth's eyes widened. "How did you know about that?" "Legal training. Secretaries always keep records. The question is whether you kept them." Ruth smiled, the expression transforming her gaunt face. "I kept everything. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away, even though looking at it made me sick with guilt. It's in storage. My daughter has the key. Can you get it? I can do better than that." Ruth reached for her phone with shaking hands. "My daughter visits every Saturday afternoon. I'll have her bring it today. And Mr. Bennett, I'm dying, stage 4 cancer. The doctors say maybe 3 months. I'd like to die knowing I finally did one right thing. I'll testify. Publicly. Whatever you need." William felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of tension he'd carried for 40 years. "Thank you." No, Ruth said firmly. Thank you for giving me the chance to make this right before I go. William left the facility with Ruth's promise and returned to the sanctuary as the afternoon sun slanted through the trees. He had work to do. The wedding suit still lay draped across the hope chest where he'd left it. William picked it up, examining it with a critical eye. It was 40 years old, but Maggie's careful preservation and Eleanor's sealed trunk had kept it in remarkable condition. The charcoal gray was classic enough not to look dated. The cut was timeless. More importantly, it was symbolic. This suit represented the wedding Hartwell had stolen, the happiness that had been taken from them, the life they should have had. Tomorrow, William would wear this suit to take back what had been stolen. Not the wedding that was gone forever, but the honor, the dignity, the truth. He spent the evening in the sanctuary planning his approach with the careful precision of someone who'd spent 50 years doing detail-oriented legal work. He knew exactly how Riverside worked, knew when people gathered, knew where crowds assembled, knew how to create a moment that people couldn't ignore or dismiss. Sunday service at Riverside Community Church began at 10 in the morning. But before service at 9 sharp, there was fellowship hour in the town square, a beloved tradition where church members and townspeople gathered around coffee and pastries for socializing before heading to worship together. It would be crowded with people, public and visible, full of potential witnesses, perfect for what William needed to do. But he understood something crucial. He needed to look like someone who deserved to be heard. The problem was, he looked exactly like what he was. An elderly man who'd been evicted, who'd spent the night in a basement, who had nothing. No one would listen to someone who looked defeated and powerless. They'd dismiss him as confused or crazy or simply irrelevant. He needed to look dignified, needed to present himself as someone whose words carried weight and whose truth mattered. The suit would help, but it wasn't enough. William found a jug of water he'd filled at a public fountain on his walk yesterday. Using that and a threadbare towel from his suitcase, he cleaned himself as thoroughly as possible. Shaved with an old razor working by flashlight, being careful not to cut himself. He combed his white hair neatly, dressed in the charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt he'd packed and the black tie he'd worn to Maggie's funeral. When he was finished, when he examined himself in the small mirror he'd brought, he saw not a homeless old man, but William Bennett, attorney at law. A man who'd spent 40 years fighting for justice. A man who'd stood in courtrooms and made judges listen. A man who deserved respect. He carefully folded the 3 letters in Ruth's promised diary into the inner pocket of the suit jacket. Evidence. Proof. Truth. Then he settled in to wait for morning. Sleep didn't come. How could it tomorrow he would do what he should have done 40 years ago? Would stand up publicly and fight for Maggie's honor. Would make Hartwell face the consequences of his lies. William spent the dark hours remembering Maggie's smile on their courthouse wedding day, determined to be happy despite everything. Remembering the way she'd held his hand through 40 years of being quietly shunned. Remembering her final words, "I'm sorry, Will. I'm so sorry I made you suffer this." He'd told her then what he'd always told her. "I choose you again, every time, in every lifetime." And he'd meant it. As dawn broke through the sanctuary entrance, painting the stone walls with golden light, William stood and straightened his tie. Ruth's daughter had delivered the diary last night as promised. It was now nestled in his jacket pocket alongside the letters, tangible proof that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. He checked his reflection one final time. 77 years old, gray hair, lined face, but standing straight and strong, dressed in the suit he'd bought for his wedding day. Today, 40 years late, he'd finally get to wear it for its intended purpose. Not to get married, but to stand up for the woman he'd married, to defend her honor, to tell the truth. William picked up his flashlight and turned it off. He wouldn't need it anymore. Whatever happened after today, he wouldn't be coming back to this sanctuary. This chapter was ending one way or another. He walked to the entrance, pulled open the heavy door, and stepped out into the morning sunlight. The walk to town square took 45 minutes. William didn't hurry. Let people see him. Let them wonder why an elderly man was walking through Riverside in an expensive suit on Sunday morning. By the time he arrived at the square, fellowship hour was in full swing. 200 people, maybe more, clustered in groups with coffee cups and conversation. Families, children, the elderly, the pillars of the community. And at the center of the largest group holding court, like the beloved elder statesman he'd successfully pretended to be for decades, stood Pastor Jonathan Hartwell. 80 years old now, white-haired and slightly stooped, but still possessing that charismatic presence that had made him so powerful and so dangerous. People clustered around him attentively, listening to his stories, laughing at his jokes, treating him like the respected community treasure he'd never actually been. William also saw his children, Robert and Catherine and David, standing with their respective families, coffee cups in hand. They hadn't noticed him yet, hadn't seen their abandoned father approaching in a vintage suit that cost more than everything he now owned. William walked straight toward Hartwell, through the crowd, moving with purpose and dignity. People noticed the suit first. The unusual vintage elegance of it made heads turn. Then they began recognizing his face, and whispers started spreading through the square like ripples across water. William stopped directly in front of Pastor Hartwell, close enough that the old man had to look at him, close enough that everyone around could hear what was about to be said. Hartwell looked up, saw William standing there, and for just one fraction of a second before he controlled his expression, William saw genuine fear flash across his face. The pastor recognized him, recognized the suit, or at least what it represented, and he was afraid. Good, William thought. He should be, because after 40 years of silence, the truth was about to be spoken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square as William Bennett stood before the man who had destroyed his life 40 years ago. The crowd's chatter faded to murmurs, then to silence, as people sensed something significant was about to happen. Jonathan Hartwell's face had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. His hands, which had been gesturing expansively while telling some anecdote, now hung frozen in midair. William let the silence stretch. 40 years of legal practice had taught him the power of timing, of letting tension build, until everyone in the room was leaning forward, desperate to hear what came next. Pastor Hartwell, William said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the square. Not loud, not shouting, just the measured, authoritative tone of a man who'd spent decades commanding courtroom attention. I've come here today wearing the coat I bought for my wedding. The wedding that was supposed to take place on June 15th, 1985. The wedding that never happened because of you. The murmurs grew louder. William saw his children pushing through the crowd, their faces registering shock and confusion. Robert's mouth was open. Catherine had gone white. David looked like he'd been struck. But William's eyes never left Hartwell's face. 2 weeks before my wedding to Margaret Hayes Bennett, you told the church elders that she had propositioned you inappropriately, that she had come to your office and suggested an affair, that she had become angry and threatening when you rejected her advances. You said you felt duty-bound to inform the community about her true character before she married an innocent man in God's house. William paused, letting the words hang in the air. He saw older members of the congregation nodding, remembering. Saw younger people looking confused, not knowing this old story. The church canceled our wedding, William continued. My family begged me to break the engagement. When I chose to believe Margaret instead of believing you, my own mother disowned me. I lost clients at my law firm, lost friends, lost everything except the woman I loved. Mr. Bennett, Hartwell began, his voice shaking slightly. I understand you're grieving your wife's death, but this is hardly the time or place for baseless accusations from decades ago. Perhaps we should speak privately, and I can help you find the counseling you clearly need. It was smoothly done, the concerned pastor trying to help a confused, grief-stricken old man. A few people in the crowd nodded sympathetically. William had expected exactly this response. It was what Hartwell had always done. Used his position, his charm, his appearance of righteousness to make his accusers seem unstable or malicious. Not this time. William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the letters, held them high so everyone could see. I'm not here to make accusations, Pastor. I'm here to present evidence. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Evidence, legal, concrete, undeniable. William saw Hartwell's face change, saw the calculation behind his eyes as he tried to figure out what William could possibly have after all these years. This first letter, William said, unfolding the yellowed paper with careful reverence, is from Ruth Miller, your secretary for 15 years, the woman who sat outside your office and scheduled your appointments. The woman who was there on the day you claimed my wife came to you. He saw Hartwell flinch at the name, saw his eyes dart toward the crowd as if looking for Ruth, perhaps wondering if she was here, if she'd finally found the courage to speak against him publicly. Mrs. Miller writes, and I quote, "I was there in the office the day Pastor Hartwell claims Maggie Bennett came to him and propositioned him. I know the truth of what actually happened that day. He called her into his office. I made the appointment myself at his request." William's voice grew stronger, more forceful, channeling every ounce of righteous anger he'd suppressed for 4 decades. I heard him through the door saying inappropriate things to her. Heard his voice take on a tone I recognized because I'd heard it before with other women. I heard her clearly and firmly tell him no. Heard her say she was engaged to be married and was leaving. I heard her leave quickly. The crowd was absolutely silent now. Even the children had stopped moving, sensing the gravity of the moment. He was angry when she left. William continued reading. I could see it in his face when he came out of his office. And within an hour, he was crafting the story he would tell the elders, practicing it in his office, where he thought no one could hear him through the walls. I heard everything. I heard him create the lie that would destroy her. William folded the letter carefully and held up the second one. This letter is from James Thornton, a businessman who had offices downtown in the 1980s. Mr. Thornton witnessed something that corroborates Mrs. Miller's account. In early May of 1985, several weeks before the scandal broke publicly, Mr. Thornton was walking through the church parking lot late one evening. He saw you, Pastor Hartwell, following my wife to her car. William saw Hartwell's throat work as he swallowed, saw sweat beginning to bead on the old man's forehead despite the cool morning air. Mr. Thornton writes, I watched him corner her by her vehicle. I was too far away to hear their conversation clearly, but I watched him touch her arm repeatedly when she tried to move past him, saw him position himself to block her path, saw him lean in close in a way that was clearly inappropriate and unwanted. I saw her push his hand away and finally managed to get into her car and drive away quickly. William pulled out the third letter from Eleanor Hayes, but he didn't read it. Not yet. Instead, he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. This, he said, holding it up so everyone could see, is Ruth Miller's office diary from 1985. The appointment book where she recorded every meeting, every phone call, every visitor to Pastor Hartwell's office. He opened it to a page marked with a slip of paper. On May 23, 1985, at 10:15 in the morning, there's an entry that reads, M. Bennett, fitting consultation per JAH request. That's Pastor Hartwell's initials. He requested the meeting. He called my wife into his office. William looked up from the diary, his eyes boring into Hartwell's. And beneath that appointment in Mrs. Miller's handwriting is a note, heard JH inappropriate with MB through door. Heard MB refuse clearly. 10:45, heard JH in office alone practicing story for elders, creating false narrative. The crowd erupted in shocked conversation. William heard people demanding explanations, heard others defending Hartwell, heard confusion and anger and disbelief warring in dozens of voices. But William wasn't finished. He raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting with the skill of someone who'd spent 40 years making juries listen. These letters were written 40 years ago by people who witnessed the truth but were too afraid of your power to speak publicly, Pastor Hartwell. They sent them to my mother-in-law, Eleanor Hayes, hoping she could use them to clear Margaret's name. William's voice grew softer, more personal, the pain of this next part evident in every word. But you found out about the letters, didn't you? You went to Eleanor's house one evening when she was alone. You threatened her, told her that if she dared to use this evidence publicly, you would dedicate yourself to destroying what remained of Margaret's life completely and thoroughly. You said you'd make sure I lost my law practice, that our children would suffer, that you'd spread even worse rumors until we wished we'd never been born. William saw people in the crowd looking at Hartwell with new eyes now, seeing not the beloved pastor, but something darker, something capable of threats and intimidation. Eleanor was 70 years old and afraid. She chose to hide the letters rather than risk your wrath. She sealed them away, hoping Margaret would find them someday, when they might be needed. William's voice broke slightly on the next words. My wife found them, 30 years ago when her mother told her about them before dying, and Margaret made the same choice Eleanor had made. She chose to keep silent rather than fight. We had 3 young children. I was trying to rebuild my career. She thought if she brought up the scandal again, it would destroy everything we'd managed to salvage. He looked around at the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as he could. So she lived 40 years with a stain on her character that she never deserved. She died 6 months ago, whispering apologies to me for the scandal. Apologizing for something she never did. Apologizing for being the victim of a powerful man's lies. William's voice hardened again, the grief transforming into steel. But before she died, she left me these letters, left me the evidence, left me a note begging me to do what she'd been too afraid to do, to clear her name, to make you tell the truth, to show this town what really happened 40 years ago. William took a step closer to Hartwell. The old pastor looked smaller, now diminished, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. So I'm asking you now publicly in front of all these witnesses, did you lie about my wife? Did you pursue her inappropriately when she was engaged to be married? Did you destroy her reputation to protect yourself when she rejected your advances? Did you steal our wedding, our dignity? 40 years of peace and respect because you couldn't handle being told no. The silence was absolute. 200 people holding their breath, waiting. Hartwell looked at the letters in William's hands, looked at the diary, looked at the crowd of people who trusted him, admired him, believed in him for decades. And William saw the exact moment when the old pastor realized he couldn't escape this, couldn't charm his way out, couldn't use his position to make this disappear. The evidence was too strong, too detailed, too corroborated. And after 40 years of living with the guilt, maybe some part of Hartwell was tired of carrying the lie. Hartwell's voice came out as a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. I didn't mean for it to go so far. The crowd erupted. People shouting, questions, demanding clarification, expressing shock and outrage. But William heard it, the admission, the beginning of truth. He held up his hand for silence, and remarkably people quieted. They wanted to hear this, needed to hear it. Hartwell looked at William with something that might have been relief mixed with resignation. I pursued her, Hartwell said, his voice growing stronger, as if confession was its own kind of liberation. Margaret, your wife, I saw her around town. She was beautiful, quiet, and I thought I was Pastor Hartwell. I was important, powerful. Women didn't say no to me. The crowd was utterly silent now, shocked into stillness by hearing their pastor admit this. But she did say no, firmly, repeatedly, and Hartwell's voice faltered. I couldn't accept it, couldn't accept being rejected by a seamstress, by someone I considered beneath me. It made me angry, made me feel humiliated. So you lied, William said quietly. It wasn't a question. So I lied, Hartwell confirmed. I went to the elders and reversed the story, made her the aggressor, made myself the righteous man defending his marriage. I knew exactly what would happen, knew the wedding would be canceled, knew she'd be destroyed, and I didn't care. I only cared about protecting myself. William heard gasping from the crowd, heard someone crying, heard his daughter Catherine's voice saying, "Oh my God," over and over. But Hartwell wasn't finished. The confession was pouring out now like water from a broken dam. And when Eleanor Hayes tried to use those letters, tried to clear Margaret's name, I went to her house and threatened her. Told her I'd make her daughter's life hell if she dared to challenge me. Scared an old woman into silence to protect my lies. Hartwell looked directly at William now, tears streaming down his weathered face. I've lived with this guilt for 40 years, Mr. Bennett. Every Sunday I stood at that pulpit and preached about truth and righteousness, knowing I was a hypocrite, knowing I destroyed an innocent woman and let her suffer for decades because I was too proud and too afraid to admit what I'd done. He turned to address the crowd. Margaret Bennett was completely innocent. Everything I said about her was a lie. She rejected my inappropriate advances, and I punished her for it by destroying her reputation. And this man, he gestured toward William, this man stood by her when everyone else, including his own family, turned away. He chose to believe her when the entire town called her a liar. He lost everything to stay loyal to her. Hartwell's voice broke completely, and she died believing she'd ruined his life, died apologizing for being the victim of my cruelty. That's what I did. That's who I am. Not a man of God, just a coward who destroyed innocent people to protect himself. The crowd erupted again, but this time William barely heard it. He was watching his children push through the mass of people toward him. Robert reached him first. His son's face was wet with tears, his expensive suit rumpled from pushing through the crowd. "Dad," Robert said, his voice breaking, "all these years, Mom was telling the truth. She was innocent. And we never fully believed her. We grew up carrying shame about something that never happened. We let you both suffer because we were too concerned with what people thought of us." Catherine grabbed William's arm, sobbing openly. "We abandoned you yesterday, laughed at you, treated you like you were nothing. And all along you were the only one who stood up for the truth. The only one who had the courage to believe Mom when everyone else called her a liar." David, the youngest, couldn't even speak. He just stood there crying, one hand covering his mouth, looking at his father with something like horrified understanding. William looked at his three children, these people he had raised with Margaret, who'd suffered because of Hartwell's lies, but had never understood the full cost of what had been stolen from their family. "Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew," William said quietly. "She lived 40 years with undeserved shame and never let it make her bitter. Never let it destroy her kindness. She died apologizing to me, but she had nothing to apologize for. Nothing." He looked past his children to the crowd, to the people of Riverside who were witnessing this moment of truth. "I didn't do this for myself," William said, his voice carrying across the square. "I'm 77 years old. I don't need vindication anymore. I did this for my wife's memory, so that her name would finally be cleared, so that her grandchildren wouldn't grow up ashamed of where they came from." He pulled out one final piece of paper. Not a letter this time, but a photograph. Maggie on their 20th anniversary, smiling at the camera, her eyes full of love and quiet strength. This woman was good, was honorable, was innocent, and for 40 years this town treated her like she was something to be ashamed of. Well, no more. Let it be known and remembered that Margaret Hayes Bennett was wrongly accused by a man who abused his power, that she lived with grace despite injustice, and that the only shame in this story belongs to those who lied about her and those who believed the lies without question. William turned back to Hartwell one final time. "You get to live with what you did, Pastor. You get to explain to your family and this community why you destroyed an innocent woman's life. But you don't get to keep the lie anymore. The truth is out now, documented, witnessed, and undeniable." Then William Bennett turned and walked away from the crowd, his head held high, the wedding suit he'd finally gotten to wear flowing behind him like a banner of dignity reclaimed. Behind him, he heard the eruption of voices, some defending Hartwell, most expressing outrage, all processing the truth that had just been revealed. He heard his children calling after him, their voices urgent and pleading. But he didn't stop walking. Not yet. He walked past the church, past the familiar streets of Riverside, and found himself at the cemetery where Maggie was buried. Her grave was simple, a modest headstone that said, "Margaret Hayes Bennett, beloved wife, 1950 to 2024. They hadn't been able to afford anything elaborate, not after the medical bills. William knelt in the grass beside her grave, his knees protesting but not caring. "I did it, Maggie," he said quietly. "I wore the suit. I told the truth. I made him admit what he did. Your name is cleared, sweetheart. Finally, after all these years, everyone knows you were innocent." The morning breeze rustled through the trees, and for just a moment, William could swear he smelled lavender. He stayed there for a long time talking to his wife, telling her everything. Telling her about the letters, about Ruth Miller, about Hartwell's confession. Telling her that their children finally understood, that their grandchildren would grow up knowing the truth. When he finally stood, his legs stiff and his heart both lighter and heavier than it had been in years, he found his children waiting at the cemetery gate. They'd given him space, had let him have this moment alone with Maggie. But they'd stayed. They'd waited. That counted for something. Robert stepped forward first. "Dad, we need to talk about everything, about how we failed you and Mom, about how we can possibly make this right." William looked at his son, at the genuine remorse in his eyes. "Your mother used to say something," William told them. "She'd say, 'Family isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up when it matters and doing the work to make things right.'" He paused, looking at each of his children in turn. "You didn't show up when it mattered yesterday. You failed. Badly. But you're here now. That's a start. We want to do more than start, Catherine said. We want to really change. To be the children you and Mom deserved. Then prove it, William said simply. Not with words, with actions, over time, consistently. David spoke for the first time since the confrontation. Can you forgive us, Dad? William thought about it, really thought about it. Your mother would want me to give you another chance, he said finally. She always believed in second chances, always hoped the best for you, even when you disappointed her. So yes, I'll give you a chance. But only one. You fail me again and I'm done. Understood. All three of them nodded solemn and sincere. As they walked together toward the cemetery gate, William's phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Bennett, this is Marcus Webb. I'm an attorney specializing in defamation cases. I saw the video of your confrontation this morning. It's already gone viral, and I'd like to talk to you about legal options against Pastor Hartwell. William stopped walking. Video. Yes, sir. Someone filmed the whole thing. It's all over social media. Millions of views already. People are calling you a hero, calling for justice for your wife. William looked at his children who were pulling out their own phones, faces showing shock as they scrolled through their social media feeds. Dad, Robert said quietly, you're everywhere. The whole country is seeing this. That evening, sitting in the small motel room his children had insisted on paying for while they figured out permanent housing, William watched the news coverage. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, all of them were running the story. 77-year-old widower exposes pastor's 40-year-old lie. Man wears wedding suit to confront the pastor who stole his wedding day. Justice delayed but not denied, elderly lawyer vindicates deceased wife. The video had been viewed 20 million times. The comments section was full of people sharing their own stories of being falsely accused of standing by loved ones when everyone else doubted, of fighting for truth against power. Someone had started a hashtag Justice for Margaret. Someone else had created one called hashtag The Wedding Suit. The Riverside Community Church had released a statement. Pastor Hartwell had resigned from all positions effective immediately. The church was conducting a full investigation into his tenure. They were offering formal apologies to the Bennett family and establishing a fund in Margaret's name to support victims of clergy abuse. Ruth Miller had been contacted by reporters. From her hospice bed, she'd given an interview confirming everything William had said, adding her own apology for not being brave enough to speak 40 years ago. But Mr. Bennett was brave enough for all of us, Ruth had said. He showed us that it's never too late to fight for the truth. Never too late to stand up for the people we love. 3 days later, Marcus Webb sat in William's motel room with a stack of legal documents. Pastor Hartwell is wealthy, Marcus explained. Inheritance, investments, real estate. And his lies directly cost you income opportunities, social connections, and caused severe emotional distress over 4 decades. We have an extremely strong case. How strong? William asked. Strong enough that I think Hartwell will settle rather than go to trial. He's already admitted everything publicly. A trial would just humiliate him further and cost him more in legal fees. Marcus was right. Within 6 weeks, Hartwell's lawyers had proposed a settlement. $2.4 million. $800,000 for economic damages, $800,000 for emotional distress, $800,000 in punitive damages. William sat in Marcus Webb's office looking at the settlement agreement. That's a lot of money, he said quietly. It's a fraction of what you actually lost, Marcus countered, but it's what we can prove and what he can pay without bankrupting himself completely. William thought about it, thought about Maggie, about what she would have wanted. I'll take it, he said, on one condition. I want to establish a scholarship fund in Margaret's name for young women from low-income families who want to learn skilled trades. Seamstresses, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, the kind of work that gives you independence and dignity. Marcus smiled. I think that can be arranged. 6 months later, William stood at the front of Riverside Community Church for a ceremony he'd never imagined would happen. The church had asked permission to install a plaque in Margaret's memory, to formally, publicly acknowledge their mistake and honor the woman they'd wronged. The plaque was beautiful, bronze mounted near the entrance where everyone would see it. In memory of Margaret Hayes Bennett, 1950 to 2024, an innocent woman who bore injustice with grace, loved with unwavering devotion, and taught us that truth, though delayed, cannot be destroyed. May we never again mistake power for righteousness or silence for guilt. The truth has no expiration date. William stood before it with his children and grandchildren gathered around him. Tommy Roberts' 7-year-old son tugged on William's sleeve. "Grandpa, what does it mean? The truth has no expiration date." William knelt down so he was eye level with his grandson. "It means that truth always matters, Tommy, even if it takes 40 years to come out. Even if the people who know the truth are afraid to speak it. Even if it seems like lies have won. Truth is still truth, and it's always worth fighting for." Tommy nodded seriously. "Like how you fought for Grandma." "Exactly like that." "When I grow up," Tommy said, "I want to be brave like you." William pulled his grandson into a hug, tears in his eyes. "You already are, buddy. You already are." That evening, William sat in his new home, a small cottage his children had helped him purchase with part of the settlement money. It wasn't fancy, but it had 2 bedrooms, a garden space, and excellent natural light. The wedding suit hung in his closet, now cleaned and preserved. Not hidden away this time, but displayed with honor. A reminder not of what had been stolen, but of what had been reclaimed. On the wall beside it hung the letters, framed now. The evidence that had changed everything. And in the garden, William had planted lavender. Maggie's flower, the scent of sanctuary and truth and love that endured beyond death. He thought about everything that had happened, about being 77 and homeless and abandoned by his children 6 months ago, about finding the letters and wearing the suit and standing in that town square demanding truth, about Hartwell's confession and the viral video and the justice that had finally come. But mostly he thought about Maggie, about 40 years of standing beside her, of choosing her over everything else, of never once regretting that choice. His phone rang, Catherine calling. "Dad, I was wondering if you'd like to come to dinner tomorrow. I'm making pot roast. I know it's Mom's recipe, but I thought maybe we could talk about her, about good memories, about who she really was." William smiled. "I'd like that very much." After he hung up, he sat in his garden as the sun set, surrounded by the scent of lavender, thinking about legacy, about what he'd leave behind. Not wealth, not fame, but something better. The truth, the example. The lesson that love is worth fighting for, that truth always matters, and that it's never, ever too late to stand up for what's right. William Bennett closed his eyes and felt the evening breeze on his face. And somewhere in whatever place good souls go when they leave this world, he liked to imagine Maggie smiling, finally vindicated, finally at peace, finally after 40 long years free.